Hope everyone is having a great day. I'm rested and refreshed, and I slept well last night. So hopefully, this mini lecture will have a little bit of energy in it. This is the 13th mini lecture on the Constitution, and you may remember in the last mini lecture I talked about representation and gave you kind of a teaser into the compromise on slavery. And that's what I want to talk about in this mini lecture. The section in your notes, I think it's B, and it says slavery. Keep in mind that slavery was essentially legal in virtually the entire northern part of the country and in the entire southern part of the country. There is no question that there were many, many, many more slaves in the southern part of the country than the northern part of the country, and that's why they tried to use slaves to enhance representation. So, in this case, though, my basic thesis is that the vast majority of delegates, there are exceptions. I told you in the last mini lecture that Benjamin Franklin went to the convention as an abolitionist. It was the last great crusade of his life. He went to the convention and actually proposed abolishing slavery, and that was not taken seriously, really, by either side. So it's my opinion that slaves became pawns between northern and southern political elites, and that in this particular case were a bargaining chip. It's intriguing because when I took this course in the 1970s, my professor tried to convince us that the Northerners were the good guys and the Southerners were the bad guys at the convention. I remember raising my hand and saying, Professor, uh, I don't think that's true. And he laughed because I had come to California from Kentucky, so I had a very thick Southern accent. He kind of laughed and he said, Oh, I suppose you think the Southerners are the good guys. And my reaction is, no, they're both bad guys. There's fleas on both dogs. In this particular case, very few people, once again, Benjamin Franklin and a couple others are exceptions, but for the most part, both sides are pursuing their selfish interests, their self interests. And once again, I want to remind you, and this is probably the third time I've done this, but don't assume that self interest is necessarily bad. I think it's kind of natural. I think people are egoistic, right? If we get involved in a dispute, we want the dispute resolved our way. So in this case, I see both Northerners and Southerners as self-interested, and I'll let you use the judgment whether you think that's bad or not. So in 1 and 2, let me lay out both sides in terms of what they want, how this is in their self-interest. But what you need to know is down in 3, and put your 5 stars there because both of those compromises will appear on the exam. So let's take a look at the supposed good guys, the Northerners, although I don't think there's anything good about this at all. Northerners wanted to count slaves for taxation, but not for representation. Now think about that. They obviously want to count slaves for taxation so that Southerners will pay most of the cost of the new government, but they don't want to give Southerners any political power for that. So, as your notes point out, if they'd gotten their way, Southerners would have paid the bulk of the new government's cost, and Northern states would have the bulk of political power. In a sense, one of the reasons why I find this, uh, why it bothers me a little bit, is because what was the number one rallying cry in northern states during the Revolutionary War? The number one rallying cry was James Otis's famous "No taxation without representation." That was the leading reason why we were fighting a war against Great Britain, because they wanted to tax us and not give us any political power for it. Now, these same people who were leading this revolution against Britain are now at the Constitutional Convention, and what are they proposing? They are proposing taxing Southern states without representation. So not only is this a self-interested position, but in a sense, in my opinion, a bit hypocritical. So that's the northern view. Now, the southerners just wanted the opposite. Once again, there's nothing good about this, in my opinion. They wanted to count slaves for representation, but not for taxation. And as your notes point out, essentially what Southerners wanted is we want increased political power. We want to use our slaves as leverage to get more representatives in Congress and to have more electoral votes in electing the president. And we want that political power for free. Both of these positions, in my opinion, are equally self-interested. And as you might guess, neither of them are going to get their way. So, like with every major item at the convention, there was a compromise, that came out of this. And as I have pointed out in your notes, I will ask you two questions. We'll go into the test bank. Now, whether the computer happens to pick these in your particular case, who knows, because I'm typing 80 questions in and the computer will randomly pick 50, but two of them that will go into that test bank. The first one is the famous or infamous one, and to me it's infamous. I told you earlier that very early in the game, the Randalls were abolitionists. So there's a lot of scoundrels in my family. I'll probably tell you some stories of some of the bad guys in my family, but certainly we were on the right side uh, of this issue. And the fact that my middle name is Grant probably is a hint as to which side my family in Kentucky fought for in the Civil War. About two-thirds of people in Kentucky were loyal to the Union and fought on the Union side, and about one-third fought for the Confederacy. So Kentucky stayed loyal to the Union, was a border state, but there were both Union and Confederate sympathizers in the state in very large numbers. So back to what you want to know, these test questions. So the Three-Fifths Compromise, this is kind of sad. This states that slaves, which are used by a euphemism, other persons in the Constitution, that slaves would count as 3/5 of a free person for both taxation and representation. 3/5 of a person. Now, there is no question in my mind that the founding fathers were very racist and even more sexist. And it's my opinion, we'll get to this later with civil rights, that even today in 2020, that men are far more sexist than racist. And I think that that's been true for a long time. But racism doesn't explain this really strange fraction. I've heard a lot of political talk shows go, well, the Three-Fifths Compromise is rooted in the racism of the founding fathers. There's no question that the founding fathers were racist, but it doesn't explain a rather odd fraction. And I want you to think about this for a minute. Imagine that we have an object, it doesn't matter what it is, and we're going to divide that object. Play along and see and think to yourself if you would rank this the same way I would, but I'll give it to you. I mean, when I think about a fraction and dividing an object, the first thing I think about is half and half. So why isn't this the 1/2 compromise instead of the 3/5 compromise? You'd be a better racist in the sense that you'd be saying a slave only has 50% the value of a free person instead of 60%. But it's not the half compromise. If I couldn't divide an object into half, I'd divide it 3/4, 1/4. And if I couldn't do that, my third fraction would be 2/3, 1/3. And then if I had to go to fourths, it would be eighths, 7/8, 1/8, or 5/8, 3/8. Now think about all these fractions that I'm laying out. If all you want to do is say that my group is better than yours, any fraction would work. And 3/5 is not a fraction that I or I hear very many people use. In fact, when I think about three-fifths, and I think about the notion of fifths in general, I really only think about fifths in three contexts. Uh, Third is this three-fifths compromise. Second is a three-fifths vote to stop a filibuster in the Senate. This is called cloture. We'll talk about it later. And by far, the runaway number one when I think about the term fifth is whiskey, a fifth of whiskey. So in this particular case, I don't believe that the Three-Fifths Compromise is rooted in the racism of the Founding Fathers, although they clearly were. But I think this was a compromise about political power. Even though Northern and Southern delegates did not have an exact census, we didn't get our first census of the United States until 1790. This year, in 2020, we have undertaken our latest census. People had a pretty good idea as to how many free people and how many slaves lived in each states. And if you take a look at the results of the 1790 census, by using the Three-Fifths Compromise, political power was about 52% in the North and about 48% in the South. Now that is dividing political power very, very evenly. So it's my belief that Northern and Southern states neither gave a damn about the slaves, that what they were worried about was the political power of their rival. And in this case, three-fifths was a way to balance political power between Northern and Southern interests. So that's the first one. The second compromise, as you can read in your notes, and it's underlined, was that Congress could ban the importation of slaves after 1808, which Congress did do. They banned the slave trade. Now, that didn't end slave trading. There was a very large domestic slave market, and up until the Civil War, you had open slave trading in places like Charleston, South Carolina, and other places. Thomas Jefferson to me is an intriguing individual because certainly people's opinions about Jefferson have changed dramatically since I was a child. When I was a child, Jefferson was kind of treated as a demigod, as obviously one of the Mount Rushmore presidents and Declaration of Independence author, etc. And of course, now when I hear a lot of commentators talk about Jefferson, they refer to him as a hypocrite preaching the equality of people while being a slave owner. There is significant evidence that Jefferson fathered several children with one of his slaves, Sally Hemings. But one of the things that Jefferson did do in this case is that Jefferson supported, while he was president, Jefferson is president in 1808. He did support the ban on the importation of slaves. So, whether you are a fan of Jefferson or a critic, this is certainly one that he got right. Now, in the minute that I have remaining, I want to point out that the big questions about slavery are not resolved at the convention. For example, as the country expands and new states are added, are those new states going to be free? Are those new states going to be slave? And who is going to decide whether these new whether these new states are free or slave? Is Congress going to decide this question? Or is it going to be popular sovereignty? Remember that phrase from the last module, right? That the people who live in those states will determine whether they are free or whether they are slave. So slavery is dealt with on the margins. Everyone understood that they could not do anything comprehensive regarding slavery because if so, the Constitution would not be ratified. So I call slavery the constitutional silence. And it's not really resolved for another 75 years. Have a great day, everyone. See you soon.